Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 17 of the Enovel survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tracks. The sun was already high in the sky as I walked briskly down the trail, scanning side to side. I had earlier left a township area, and Bill had dropped me via the four-wheeler just outside of our patrol zone. He wanted to go further, but I did not want to risk him, did not want to give away my presence with the noise of an engine. I was traveling light. I had to catch up with a man whose trail was a day old. Still, I knew I could find him. He was easy to track. He left misery and destruction in his path. That morning as I was packing, Leroy came in and spoke to me. "Al, I think the man you were hunting is the same one that shot me." I hadn't thought of that, but suddenly it made sense, especially when he told me more details. "The man is a sadist," he said. "Dangerous, too. He's big, he's fast, and he's mean." He paused and started to take his arm out of the sling, saying, "That's why I'm going with you, brother." I was moved by the man's courage, his toughness, and the gesture. I put my hand gently on his arm, but with just enough pressure so he could feel the wound was still tender. "Sorry, Airborne, but I need you here. If he doubles back this way, I need to know you are in my house. I don't need that hanging over my head." This was partly true, but the main reason was that I would be moving fast, and a big party would be handy if I caught him, but might also give him more targets to pick off on the way. Leroy started to protest, but I had cut him off, and I saw a little mist in his eyes as he said, "You be careful, trooper." I smiled back and said, "All the way and then some." Leroy smiled, and there was an awkward moment before he said, "You'll be needing help packing. I'll go see Miss Jacqueline and see if she needs help with it." I had taken only freeze-dried rations from my bug-out bag. I stripped my gear down to the bare essentials. I would take my basic load of ammo, my pistol with 2 magazines, chest rig with no armor, plates, the Gore-Tex bivy bag with a poncho liner to sleep in, map, compass, and my 2-reg radio with a few batteries, binos, knife, and little else. I had one mission to accomplish, and that was to eliminate this man. I would try to bring him back alive to stand trial, and realized this would be a lot harder to do than to simply shoot him on sight, which is what I really wanted to do. On the downhill portions of the trail, I therefore tried to trot, scanning around me and stopping periodically to listen for a moment. I returned to the place I had found Adolph's body, our beloved sheriff and friend. Fortunately, it had not rained in days, or I would have little chance to find any sign. Even still, it would be tough. From there, I walked concentrically larger circles, scanning the ground until I found footprints. I had an idea he would head toward the town of Presque and would prey upon someone else along the way. I was right about the footprint. I found it. I tried to get inside the man's head now, and I had a better picture. A vicious and dangerous man, a sadist, powerful and strong. I had no illusions of the danger the man posed. Never underestimate your enemies. That had been pounded into my head over the decades when I was a soldier. Now I was being very cautious, but also aggressive. He had to be stopped. If I delayed, it might cost another innocent their life. He had food, there was an abundance of water, and he would need a little shelter this time of year. It was cool at night, but not freezing, and he probably had a sleeping bag he had stolen from Eddie. I winced when I thought of that slow and gentle man, and my resolve deepened, my pace quickened as I headed down the trail in that direction. The area was too big for me to just look everywhere. I needed to narrow it down, and the man was wicked good at not leaving sign. I knew that already. What would motivate him? Where would he need to go next? He would head for civilization and look for another target, as much for the food as for improving his opportunities to survive and perhaps the chance to kill again, for he obviously enjoyed it. I thought how opposite we were. He enjoyed hurting people, killing. I hated it and wished and prayed for peace, and hated this man for disturbing it, for taking the lives of so many. No telling how many he had slaughtered already. I prayed there would not be one more. The trail led to a stream, and I needed water and knew he would have stopped as well. Using concentric circles again, I radiated outward, and about 20 feet downstream I found it, the place he had stopped to drink. In the stream bed I could see a single algae-covered rock that had been displaced. The algae side was still up, but it was tilted slightly offset. I next saw the clear depression of a knee in the soft mud. No footprint but the knee. He had put his foot on a stone, and I saw a little mud on that stone. He was clever, but had not put his knee on something hard because of the pain. That he knew he was being tracked was either a feature of habit with him, or he was on to me. I nervously looked around, fearful that I might have blundered into a trap myself. After a while I settled down and realized that he was probably still a full day ahead. Hopefully he would get lazy and sloppy and tired, or all three. I found more subtle signs. A place where his rucksack had sat. It had an external frame and appeared to be an Army-issue Alice type. The pack appeared to be not too heavily loaded, judging by how he had set it down. I found a single depression in the earth nearby where he had sat, and several faint glimmerings of footprints, but nothing distinct. Still, I could tell much from them. The splaying of his feet, the amount of displacement said he was a heavier man and probably a bit overweight. The feet were not overly splayed out, which meant he was not carrying too much gear in his rucksack, at least not proportional to his body weight, which I guessed to be around 250 pounds. Leroy's description of the man as having dark hair and being fat, combined with the things I was learning, were telling me more. Because of his size, he would not be accustomed to going without food. He could do so, of course, but would not do so willingly. Beyond these small things, there was nothing further, so I rejoined the trail and headed in the same direction. I guessed that he would head this way also because he had not diverted up or down the stream, and I saw no signs to indicate further scarring or displacement. I quickened my pace despite the danger from this man as well as from other possible predators, reckless but also necessary. I also prayed God would lead me to him quickly, and again asked that he stay my hand and mine from vengeance, but strengthen it to justice. I felt a little stronger now and pushed hard southwest towards Presque. I would have to close the gap before he killed again. Let them eat cake. John Casolo sipped his mineral water impatiently, angry at having to wait so long for his lunch to be served. The service at La Rue was the worst he had ever encountered, almost as bad as the name of this place, which simply meant the way. The chef and his staff were not much better. Hard to get a good chef and staff at the last, as they had many of the other help here at the Eagle's Lair. Most had probably been caught up in the chaos of the imploding cities where the best establishments were. Still, he was glad they had gotten out and had to chuckle at how he and most of the others had bought their way in. Most had used government bailout funds for their ticket, for their buy-in fees, having their accountants cleverly write it all off. Joe had even been able to write that off his taxes as well, although his investment and insurance company never paid a penny in taxes, often getting money back from the government. All it cost him was campaign contributions made in the right place. He laughed when he thought of how the return on investment, or ROI, was so rich in that area. How easily politicians would sell out the taxpayers for so little money. He estimated that his ROI in the year before the collapse was 987 to 1, meaning for every dollar he invested into influence peddling with the federal government, his attorneys told him that he received back $987 in some sort of advantage. The fact that he and so many of the others at Eagle's Lair had helped cause the economic collapse which had pushed the world over the brink was a minor inconvenience to them at the moment. Joe smiled as he thought of his conversation just yesterday on the secure radio link with his favorite senator, somewhere in Maryland, who had lied to him that any day now things would be back to normal. Joe knew it would be years, and other than the poor service and lack of good help here, was prepared to wait it out. When things got back to normal, he would make sure that he and the others, the bankers and investors, would be positioned to control everything, just as they had always done in the past, just as they always would in the future, and just as they were at the moment. The invisible hand, as it were. He thought of the plight of the average citizens out there, but not in empathetic terms, rather the way one would about a herd of cattle that had just stampeded over a cliff. He reasoned they would figure things out, would get back on their feet eventually, and when they did, he and his friends would be right there to get everything they were entitled to. The casualty estimates the senator had shared were, of course, lopsided in light, and Joe knew from other sources that things were far worse. This bothered him only because while thinning the herd was always good, a bit too much had occurred, and this would mean the recovery would simply take longer. Looking about, Joe noted that the usuals included several teenage girls, the daughters of some of the other members of Eagle's Lair. He smiled as he thought how sexy they looked in their tennis outfits and doubted seriously if they had played a single match this morning. They were showing off, flirting, and probably upset at how few teenage boys there were. Although there were a fair number of teenagers, sons and daughters of the other members, there were no small children. Good thing that, because Joe hated them, always screaming and crying, useless eaters. He leered a bit too long, and one of them rolled her eyes at him in disgust and said something to her friends as they looked in his direction, snickering. He lifted his glass to them in salute as his response and winked salaciously. They all spun their backs to him, which made him mad. He was not accustomed to refusal. Fortunately, though, they had recruited a lot of extra female help, attractive young single women whose motivation to keep their jobs was very admirable. Finally, his meal arrived. The waiter was as inept as he was clumsy, and he nearly dropped the steak as he set it in front of Joe, his arm coming a little too close to Joe in the process. What an oaf. The steak was, of course, part of the vast stock of food laid in, and there was enough cattle here, barring a plague or disease, to provide ample food for years to come. The waiter set the plate down, complete with braised green beans and a fresh pasta salad, then turned and picked up the pepper grinder. "Pepper, sir." Joe didn't like the man's look. He lacked polish, lacked the subtle and fluid grace that he was accustomed to in his waiters. "No, I don't want any pepper, he snapped rudely. "What I want is someone who knows how to serve a fine meal." The man wisely avoided making eye contact, though, a cardinal rule from the help whenever addressing any of the members of Eagle's Lair. They were expendable and could be put out at any time. A one-way helicopter ride, blindfolded. So far, none had been sent away like this, but the mere threat of it was a powerful tool and incentive that Joe wielded frequently. Just last night, the maid had shown her motivation to keep her job. Several times, in fact. A wicked smile curled across Joe's face as he cut into his steak. "How would you like to take a little helicopter ride today? What's your name?" Joe looked at the man's name tag, an elegant gold-colored one. "Philip." Hearing the name spoken, the man looked obviously nervous. "No, sir," he spoke, looking at the ground. "What's that, Philip?" He spoke the name contemptuously. "I couldn't hear you." "No, sir," the man said a little louder. Chewing his food, Joe said imperiously, "No, sir, what, Philip?" "No, sir, you don't want to take a helicopter ride," or "No, sir, you don't want to take it today." The man swallowed and his hands shook a bit. Joe, enjoying himself, looked around at the other patrons nearby and caught their affirming smiles and nods. Everyone knew the value of reminding help and other people of their place and station in life, after all. "No, sir, I don't want to take a helicopter ride today, sir." The man spoke urgently. "Please, sir," he begged. Joe smiled, enjoying the absolute power he exercised over the man. It was intoxicating. He thought that this must be the kind of power the coal and railroad barons had once enjoyed. The power to dominate and control another human being so thoroughly, to crush them if necessary. Forget all that nonsense about leadership and motivation, respect and admiration. Absolute authority didn't need to pretend, to bother with such foolishness. It was so much more satisfying this way. Looking at his meal and cutting his steak, Joe stated, "Philip." He said the man's name as if it were something distasteful in his mouth. "You do realize your employment is a privilege here, don't you?" Philip hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "Yes, sir," Joe quickly retorted. "Yes, sir, what, Philip?" "You didn't learn very quickly, do you, Philip?" Again his name spoken like something unpleasant. "Yes, sir, I do realize it is a privilege, sir." Joe stopped for a moment and said, because I would judge by your demeanor, your obvious lack of motivation to learn your profession, that you presume your job is some sort of a right, an entitlement." He said the word entitlement slowly, pausing on every syllable. "Is that what you think, Philip? Do you think you are entitled to be here?" Before he could answer, Joe said, "Philip, you might want to go pack your things up tonight and get ready for that little helicopter ride. Unless," he paused, "unless by tomorrow I have perhaps had a change of mind." Continuing, he said, "That will depend largely upon how I feel tomorrow." He looked dead into Philip's face, trying to catch his eyes, but the man put his head down further, cowering. "You had better pray to God I don't have a bad morning, Philip." Smirking, he turned back to his food and said dismissively, "Why are you still here, Philip? Go away." The man scurried away, and Joe looked up at his audience, the other members, noting the approving nods and smiles. Joe thought to himself that the man would definitely not sleep tonight, and chuckled at that one. Lord Acton once said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He wondered if anyone understood why, though. Power was intoxicating, like a drug, and Joe was high on it, exhilarated. The traveling circus. Ox tried to fight the sleepiness he felt as the sun shone warm, even hot through the window of his Humvee. It was a beautiful sunny day outside, early spring, perfect for travel, he thought, also perfect to get ambushed. The radio crackled. It was Mitchell. "Talon 6, this is 1. Ox chuckled at how Mitchell was always on, always the ranger. "1, this is 6, send it," he responded. 6, be advised, route Dallas is clear. I say again, clear. 1, this is 6, copy, Dallas is clear, out. The Singars' radios were still working well, and Ox was not concerned if anyone was listening. Nobody else would know who Talon was, where Dallas was, and what any of the checkpoints represented outside of the members of this convoy. On his knee, the Ox had a gas station road map which he looked at. Dallas was highlighted in green and was the secondary route. Mitchell had picked 3 routes going north, and the primary, Houston, was the main highway and was not navigable. It would have taken them into Montreal and Canada, which meant nothing in light of the current collapse, but the roads were choked with abandoned vehicles. Dallas was the next best alternative, and Austin would be much more lengthy if Dallas or Houston were not navigable. Per Mitchell's plan, a 2-vehicle element was sent ahead and would scout far beyond and away from the convoy of 9 buses and 4 Humvees, 2 in front and 2 in the rear with buses in between. 5 buses were filled with food and fuel containers and scavenged food, fuel tanks, all carrying every gallon of fuel from the armory with them. Every vehicle was topped off and not a drop of fuel was left behind. The other 4 buses were filled with his little army, 197 additional people. His foot soldiers, or cannon fodder, as he and Mitchell referred to them, although not in their presence. They would be used to soften up targets, to do grunt work, and to scout for resources. Ox was finding them useful, but also a giant headache logistically. They ate like an army. 2 days ago, just before they moved from the armory, they had gone by the Walmart in town. Inside the store, the ammo and everything else, even remotely useful, was gone, But outside they found several Connex boxes there, locked with high security padlocks. Someone had tried to break into them, of course, but the locks in a steel construction had prevented them. A cutting torch was used to cut right through the hasps and locks. Most were filled with junk like televisions, furniture, and other non-essentials. One, though, was filled with bicycles, and another with clothing. Those bicycles were now strapped to the top of the buses and hanging off the sides. Even kids' bikes. Everyone had a bicycle, and these would be used to extend the range and speed of the scouting parties. With this kind of intelligence gathering tool, they might just be able to find enough food to keep themselves going and not have the logistical hassles of fueling vehicles and repair parts so frequently. If a bike broke, it was not a big deal anyway, not that crucial. The smell of diesel in the air was reassuring to Ox. For a moment his mind drifted back to the way life was just a few months before the collapse, to being able to pull into a gas station and fill up and grab a six-pack of beer and some chips. Now he would be happy for just a sip of beer. Shamrun knew how to set up a still, but they would need corn and sugar to ferment to make their own booze. Ox reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out the bottle there, nearly gone. He was nursing the bottle because he knew without it he would get the shakes again, only drinking a sip when needed. They would head for a place called St. Quentin and then forge west to Bathurst, Canada. The Ox, Mitchell, and Shamron reasoned that these areas were remote, yet had good natural resources of land, farms, fishing, water, and other essentials. They would seek to dominate the entire country and county and had a unique plan. In exchange for providing security to these locals, they would be provided with food, water, and other resources in return. Sort of like mafia protection money, only they would actually defend them from other looters. This was good business, as Ox saw it. Like a herd of sheep, you don't want wolves coming in and eating. They would be like a herd of livestock whose purpose in life would be to provide for Ox and his men. The things they demanded would be a sort of a tax, a tribute. Ox liked the sound of that word, tribute. It made him feel like a Roman emperor. They had been skirting to the north of the White Mountain National Forest on Highway 2. Up ahead the sign said, "Entering Maine." They would stop soon, just before they left the National Forest, and bivouac for the night. Ox figured it would be more secure this way, further from town. He was also finding this route to be a bit more secure. They had seen no sign of life or habitation all day, but some of that was because of the noise they made. This many vehicles, nobody would want to tangle with, especially with the heavy machine guns which his gunners manned aggressively. They would pass by Bangor tomorrow, and then the following day would cut through Houlton and go north to a town named Caribou. They would need to forage sometime in the next 3 days, and Caribou sounded like as good a place as any to spread out and try, especially before they moved into their target area, nearby and to the north. Caribou. Ox studied the map carefully, noting the lack of towns nearby, and figured it was either all forest or perhaps farmland. He set the map back in his cargo pocket and tried not to fall asleep as the Humvees droned on. Fortunately, Mitchell had everything arranged so he could relax. They would bivouac soon, and he would need no encouragement falling asleep tonight. Clever. The wind whistled through the firs, howling loudly. Now his Dirty shivered a bit at the cold which seemed to bore down into his bones. He and the snake had reapplied their camouflage and would wait until dusk before moving into position to begin their methodical reconnaissance of the compound. They checked each other's camo before moving and used their PVS-14s to scan periodically. After about an hour, they came to a thick stand of fir trees nearly a half-mile away from the compound. There before them spread a large and quite beautiful little city. In front of them lay several hundred beautifully arranged acres with a large city fortress in the middle, like an ancient feudal castle. Dirty recognized that the cleared pastures and row crops would also give excellent observations and fields of fire to the defenders of the city. Very clever. Using their PBS-14s, they began slowly scanning and recording what they saw with their digital cameras. They would shoot footage throughout the night and take note of guards, changes of guards, alertness, and other patterns. Both men knew how to do this very well and had done it not only in the military but also against the rivals of the fallen. Around the city were a pair of chain-link fences with triple strands of concertina wire on each. Inside this corridor, men patrolled by with dog teams. The men all wore a very sharp-looking forest green uniform of trousers and button shirts with matching ball caps, and were well armed and equipped with body armor and what looked like Sig Sauer 308 rifles, also carrying pistols, although they would have to wait until daylight to be sure of this. At intervals around the perimeter were 8 40-foot high towers festooned with digital cameras and other equipment. The snake saw several ground radars as well as listening cones. These guards had state-of-the-art equipment, the finest money could buy. These people took their security quite seriously. On the helipad there were 3 helicopters. Each had a door gun mounted, and the snake was dismayed to note that they had miniguns, not simple machine guns. If these birds got airborne, they would present some serious firepower that could be brought to bear quickly at any point along an attacker's avenue of approach. The city had few lights on at this time of night, and the snake noted that this kept the ambient light down, but it was still fairly obvious from a distance. Probably the spoiled rich kids didn't want to do without their luxuries. Snake guessed whomever was in charge of security must be having a nightmare of a time trying to tell someone who was accustomed to always getting his way that maybe his way wasn't such a good idea this time. Thus, the city was putting off a fairly good horizon light signature, especially in this remote area. Rich fools, the snake thought. You have it all, and that's not enough. Got to light up the night sky, too. Thanks for showing us the way in. It would be a long 3 days, and per agreement, Snake pulled himself up into a ball with a thin poncho liner he produced from a small pack, and quickly fell asleep while Dirty pulled security. Back shooter. The drone of the diesel engine, the bright sun in the sky, all reminded the men of happier times, and they knew they were near their destination. Suddenly, Butch's head burst into a blood-red crimson blossom, splattering his brains and pieces of his skull into Phelps' face. Instinctively, he and Clarence crouched down and tried to determine where the rounds came from. Bullets thumped as they penetrated the sheet metal sides of the truck and made a whacking noise when they hit something solid like frame or engine block. Phelps jumped forward, grabbed the wheel to steer from the back seat, and yelled to Clarence, "Push the gas pedal with your hand." Down driver drills were something they all knew from Iraq and Afghanistan, and Clarence was already on the floor doing just that as the engine roared in response. Whoever was shooting at them would be trying to stop the vehicle somehow, and as the vehicle roared over the crest of the steep hill, it became obvious how. Ahead, the road was blocked from side to side with several cars, and behind these were men shooting. They were shooting a sustained rate of fire, not wildly but carefully, all seemingly aimed at the driver. There had also been several men up the road, one of whom had obviously been the best shot, the one who had initiated the ambush and who had killed Butch. Their mission was simple, and that was a very calculated ambush. Stop the truck by killing the driver. That being said, accurate fire is hard to accomplish under pressure, especially on a moving vehicle. Everyone is a hero at the range, a dead accurate shot in their own imagination, but in reality and in a fight, most rounds miss. Still, though, rounds continued to pop and chip away at the vehicle as Phelps quickly assessed that he would not be able to clear the roadblock. He told Clarence, "Off gas now," and Clarence lifted his hands from the gas as Phelps swerved the vehicle to the left in a very controlled manner. When the vehicle was straight, he said, "On gas," and Clarence complied. The vehicle tires bit into the gravel and then the grass of the shoulder as they lunged down the steep ditch, the bumper clipping the earth at the bottom before they launched up the other side and into the trees. "Hang on," he said, and Clarence tucked up into a ball. Joshua tried to do the same as the vehicle crashed into a large tree. The sudden impact threw Phelps over the seat and into the windshield, but his body armor had saved him from breaking bones, although he thought his back was surely broken. Clarence was in better shape. He had tucked up into a fetal position on the floor. Neither man had his helmet on, but all had been wearing body armor that day. They reasoned they would have time to put helmets on if they were ambushed. They reasoned wrong. They were a good 50 feet deep into the woods now, and the men at the roadblock would be approaching cautiously if they were smart. Despite his pain, both men were warriors and their training kicked in. Instantly they grabbed for their helmets and weapons. Phelps scrambling into the back seat to get his and out the door and straight to the ground. Steam was pouring from the vehicle, and the men were using it as much as possible by staying prone to the ground and waiting. Both closed the doors behind them instinctively, something they had been trained to do. In the military, an armored Humvee is a fighting vehicle. Leaving a door open left the driver and gunner exposed to enemy fire. Phelps would cover the right side and the rear, knowing the initial shooters would be coming from the right. Clarence would have the men from the roadblock to his left. He covered left and rear. They did not have long to wait. "Let 'em think we're dead, Clarence," Phelps said, and "Roger" was the reply. Clarence might have been a quiet man, but Phelps assessed that he was not afraid, would more than hold his own. Soon they heard the men speaking to each other. "I see the truck," one man said. "Me too. The doors are still shut," another said. "Careful," came the voice of a third. Disoriented still, but slowly getting reoriented, Phelps slowly rotated the safety switch off his weapon and heard the faint and almost imperceptible click of Clarence's weapon doing the same. A quiet but very solid signal between warriors, as if to say, "I will fight. I am ready." Phelps was glad to have Clarence right now and wished they also had Butch. This would be no easy fight. Had no idea who they were up against. The men from the roadblock itself arrived first, spread out and carrying weapons and at a crouch. Almost all had bolt-action hunting rifles, and 2 had shotguns. One man had a large, shiny pistol with a scope on it. He would actually be more of a threat than the rifles at this range, Phelps thought, and knew that Clarence was already calculating this too. When the men were less than 30 feet away, Clarence opened fire, shooting the man with the shiny pistol first. He took the easy shot, and the pistol arrow fell forward, shot dead center in the chest. A tall, skinny man in a camouflage shirt, crumpled a second later, shot in the gut by Phelps as the other men started to scramble for cover. One of them fell, shot in the hip, and did not fall far enough to the ground. Phelps finished him off with 2 shots through the side, which spun him around. He sat there, confused, on the ground, and Phelps shot him through the side of the face and watched his jaw rip off his head and spin violently before he finally fell dead. The 3 other men began to fire wildly at the truck. They lacked the firepower to overcome the 2 soldiers with their modern rifles. There was a reason the semi-automatic rifle was the weapon of choice for every military in the world. It was 100 years ahead of the bolt-action rifle. Probably the same way men with bolt-action felt when going against men armed with muskets over 100 years before that. The men with the shotguns were the biggest threat, but right now the only thing on everyone's mind was kill or be killed. The remaining men suddenly broke away and ran. Phelps shot one in the back, and he fell to his knees, dropping his weapon, and screamed in pain. His body fell in plain view, and Phelps shot him 3 more times. Clarence shot at but missed the other 2 as they ran for their lives and were soon out of view. Because the other men were still out there, but not in sight, Phelps and Clarence did not get up and chase. In combat, they learned quickly that only fools stuck to chivalrous notions about war. He remembered reading a political article written by some bloviating coward criticizing a combat veteran for backshooting a Viet Cong during a firefight. The expert, of course, had no combat experience, just like a lot of other experts. You don't let your enemies run away, ever. They may be running to get a bigger weapon or more people. Phelps remembered shooting a man in the back the same way in Afghanistan. You killed them or they killed you. Surrender or die were the only two choices we gave our enemies, and they usually gave us only one of those two in return. They both knew Butch was dead. They would see to him later. After a few minutes, both men crawled forward carefully until they could see the road and the roadblock. They crawled past the bodies of the men they had just shot. One was still groaning a bit in pain. Phelps crawled over to him and took his weapon away. The men who had initiated the roadblock were gone. Phelps scanned through his rifle, and nearly half a mile away he saw several men running toward a cluster of houses. As he looked, he saw women and children coming out of them. He was reminded of Afghanistan, of fighting there, how war had always included women and children in proximity, how his enemies had families. It always seemed so antiseptic in the movies, but in reality, armies are made up of men and women who themselves have spouses and families and loved ones. Phelps had family too. So did Clarence. So did Butch. Clarence, we have to get out of here. Too many angles. Angles was a term used to refer to angles of attack, directions you could be fired upon from. Clarence nodded. They returned to the truck, and each man got his rucksack and quickly stuffed food, ammunition, and water into these on top of their sleeping bags and other items already inside. All three of them had their rucksacks packed mission style, just as their standard operating procedures, or SOPs, had taught them, with a few minor variations. Phelps got Butch's ruck out of the back of the truck and took the food and ammo from it, and then went to the cab to Butch's body. His lifeless form lay slumped over the steering wheel, a giant hole blowing out of the back of his head. Phelps gently rolled him back. "Sorry, buddy," he said sincerely, and felt great sorrow at the loss of this man. Why did war take good men and allow the evil ones to live? Behind him, the wounded man lay on the ground groaning and cursing at Phelps. Phelps reached in between the seats of the vehicle and got out the pistol, walked over and shot the man twice in the face, then returned to the body of Butch. He carefully dragged Butch from the vehicle and lay him on the ground, folded his arms over his chest, and then took his magazines and first aid pouch from his body armor and put these into his own rucksack. He strapped Butch's rifle to the side of his rucksack after unloading it and cinched it down and drug it away from the vehicle as Clarence pulled security. "Need help with Butch?" Clarence asked. Phelps paused, put his hand on Clarence's shoulder and said, "I got it. Did you see the Ville?" Ville was short for a village, a reference also to their common history of having fought in Afghanistan. Clarence nodded, and Phelps knew he would be watching that direction carefully. Next, he pulled out Butch's poncho liner and laid it over their friend, and then doused the body with several gallons of diesel. He doused the vehicle and the gear in the back. These people would get nothing for their thievery but dead bodies. Phelps went over to the dead enemies and took their rifles, removed the bolts, and threw the rifles into the back of the truck. He would throw the bolts into a river somewhere. It would be a tragedy to get shot by a weapon you had abandoned on the battlefield intact. The rifle was not ammo they had was not a caliber they could use, and the men had very little of it anyway, but he threw it in his ruck as well. One of the men they shot had a shotgun, a nice Remington though, a 12-gauge pump with a beautiful stock on it. He took this and a bag of shot shells and set them next to Clarence's ruck, and also got the pistol with scope and put these next to him. He had taken all of these off the dead pistolero. "I got security, brother," he said, and took a knee while Clarence loaded his and this gear. When finished, they went to the body of their friend, bowed their heads and said goodbye before Clarence took out his lighter and lit the edge of the poncho liner. The flames spread quickly to the truck, and soon a billowing cloud of black smoke rose into the sky as the two men shouldered their rucks, turned, and walked briskly away, weapons at low ready, moving west toward a forested area. They would check maps and have a think over things later, for now they had to clear the immediate area. The men who had escaped would regroup, would get reinforcements and return. Today they had killed a good man, Butch. Tomorrow they would be a little smarter and fix the holes in their ambush plan. The next victims would not be so fortunate. Sick. Martha chuckled a little as she noted Rachel scrubbing the floor in the hallway. Every time some noise sounded like the door opening, the girl would spin around and expectantly look with a smile. When it was nothing, or perhaps Caleb, she would look literally crestfallen. Martha recognized all the symptoms. The girl was sick, lovesick. She had seen it in the eyes when Joshua and his friends had left. She also had seen it in his. Martha smiled for another reason. She knew something that neither of them knew. She knew Joshua would be back. She had seen this so many times in her life. It was always the same. God did not do things accidentally. He had purpose and deliberation to everything. Although God did not ask it, Martha on her own had done a little something too, just to make sure. She took the liberty of writing a little note and stuffing it into Joshua's pocket without him knowing it. That note would not bring him back alone, but it wouldn't hurt either. It was her way of just making sure. The screen door blew and Rachel looked back quickly. Martha smiled and went over to pick up the wash water bucket, exchanging it for fresh. As the girl went back to her scrubbing, Martha kneeled down. I used to look for Caleb all the time too. That's how I knew he was the one. Rachel was taken aback at this. Had she been so obvious? Martha's round little face and clear eyes beamed at her. Yes, dear, and there is something else that is obvious to me too. Well, what is that, please? Rachel asked her aunt most desperately. Martha turned a little smiling and said, Oh, just the way Joshua was looking at you, my dear. A quick glance back and she could see the girl's countenance practically glowing. Yes, dear, tonight and from now on you must remember Joshua in your prayers. I will ask Caleb to join us. Pausing to reflect, she said, Dear, you must think of one other thing in your prayers. What, Aunt Martha, what? Rachel said eagerly. You must consider that he may not want to join with us to adopt our ways. Rachel looked sad at this, and Martha touched her face reassuringly. So, when he asks you to go with him, don't forget to take God with you. Chuckling, as she turned to walk away, she said, Don't worry, we will always be your flesh and blood, always love you, always be here, and so will God. Rachel returned to her chores with a renewed vigor. She would have to start thinking about things differently from now on. The man who had captured her heart would be bringing it back. Looking to heaven, she asked humbly and simply, Please, God, make it soon. This has been Chapter 17 of the e-novel survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Please tune in next Friday for Chapter 18. Thank you.